When Isabella Wade pulled the infamous Captain Nathaniel Blackwood from drowning waters, she unknowingly traded her brother's life for a debt that would bind her to the most dangerous pirate crew in the Caribbean. Now, with 200 armed men at her door and the Royal Navy hunting survivors, she faces an impossible choice: accept the captain's protection and sail into a world of violence and freedom, or stay behind and face execution as a traitor to the crown. The dawn broke blood-red over the Caribbean horizon, painting the waves crimson as Isabella Wade waded through shallow tide pools, her worn basket half filled with morning clams. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. 3 days since father's boat returned empty. 3 days of rationed bread and borrowed salt. Her bare feet navigated sharp rocks with practiced ease, skirts tucked high above her knees, sun-bleached hair escaping its simple braid. Thunder rolled across calm morning skies. She froze, scanning the horizon. Not thunder cannon fire. 2 ships materialized through lifting fog, locked in deadly embrace barely a mile offshore. Black smoke poured from shattered masts as orange flashes erupted along their hulls. The distinct crack of musket fire carried across the water, followed by men's screams. Isabella's heart. Thomas, her brother, had left 6 months ago on a merchant vessel, swearing to return with enough coin to save their father's failing fishing trade. But she'd heard whispers in Port Royal's taverns, whispers of good men turning pirate when Royal Navy pressed them into service, when starvation made outlaws of honest sailors. The larger ship bore the unmistakable colors of His Majesty's Navy. The smaller vessel flew tattered black sails, already listing dangerously, her mainmast a shattered ruin trailing into churning waters. Thomas! The name tore from her throat as she dropped her basket, clams scattering across wet sand. She couldn't think past the overwhelming certainty burning through her chest. Her brother was on one of those ships. She knew it the way she knew tides and winds, the way she knew her own heartbeat. Isabella plunged into the surf, cotton dress immediately dragging with seawater's weight. The swim from shore to shipwreck would kill most women 2 miles through Caribbean swells, fighting currents that drowned experienced sailors. But she'd grown up in these waters, had swum since before she could walk, diving for pearls with her mother before fever took her. 50 yards out, the world narrowed to breath and stroke. Cannon fire continued its deadly percussion. Wood exploded in spectacular showers of splinters. Men's bodies plummeted from burning rigging, swallowed by indifferent waves. The pirate ship groaned like a dying beast, tilting further as the ocean claimed her hold. Debris fields spread across the surface, shattered barrels, torn sailcloth, bodies floating face down in spreading crimson pools. Isabella swallowed rising bile, swimming harder, searching desperately for her brother's familiar form among the carnage. A man surfaced 20 feet ahead, thrashing weakly, clearly wounded. Not Thomas Broader's shoulders, longer dark hair, streaming water. He went under again, didn't resurface. Isabella dove without hesitation. The man sank rapidly, weighted by weapons and heavy leather coat. She grabbed his collar, fighting to drag him upward through crushing pressure. Her lungs screamed for air. Black spots danced across her vision. With final, desperate strength, she kicked toward filtered sunlight, breaking surface with gasping cry. The man remained unconscious, blood seeping from a gash across his temple. Isabella hooked her arm under his chin, beginning the grueling swim back to shore. Behind them, the pirate vessel gave its death rattle, stern rising skyward before sliding beneath the waves in eruption of bubbles and steam. "Thomas!" She screamed the name again and again, even as she pulled the stranger through the surf. Even as her muscles trembled with exhaustion, even as hope died cold and certain in her chest. The beach seemed impossibly distant. Her arms burned with lactic acid, legs cramping in protest. The man's dead weight threatened to drag them both under with every wave. But Isabella Wade had inherited her father's stubbornness, her mother's unbreakable will. She would not let another soul drown, not today, not ever. When her feet finally found sand, she collapsed, dragging the unconscious pirate into shallow water. His chest rose and fell with labored breathing. Alive. Blood still seeped from his temple wound, mixing with seawater and sand. Isabella looked back at the empty horizon where two ships had battled. The Royal Navy vessel sailed away victorious, leaving only debris and bodies in its wake. No survivors swam toward shore. No familiar voice called her name across the water. Thomas was gone. She pressed her forehead against wet sand, salt water streaming down her face, seawater, and tears indistinguishable. Grief and exhaustion crushing her chest until she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but hold the stranger's head above the tide and wait for her heart to remember how to beat. Isabella dragged the unconscious pirate across the beach, leaving a trail of seawater and blood through sand. Her father's cottage stood a quarter-mile up the coastal path, weathered wood silvered by decades of salt spray. Every muscle screamed protest, her waterlogged dress weighing 30 pounds. But she couldn't leave him on the beach, not with Royal Navy patrols sweeping the coastline for survivors. Why she protected him, she couldn't articulate. Perhaps because Thomas had become what this man was. Perhaps because she'd failed to save her brother and refused to fail again. Perhaps because something in his scarred, dangerous face called to the reckless part of her that had always longed for horizons beyond fishing nets and hungry winters. She dropped him in the small boat shed behind their cottage, where father stored nets and tackle. The stranger remained deeply unconscious, his breathing steady but shallow. Isabella fetched water and cloth, cleaning the gash across his temple with practiced hands. She'd tended father's fishing injuries since she was 10 years old. Up close, the man radiated barely contained violence even in unconsciousness. Scars mapped his exposed chest where his torn shirt had fallen open, knife wounds, old burns, the distinctive pucker of musket balls. Tattoos covered his left arm, an intricate ship, a compass rose, words in script she couldn't read. 3 gold rings pierced his right ear. A leather cord around his neck held a tarnished silver medallion engraved with a skull and crossed swords. Pirate. Not just any pirate, his hands bore calluses of someone who'd spent decades gripping rope and steel, his sun-weathered skin speaking of years under Caribbean. The quality of his leather coat, even waterlogged and torn, suggested rank. An officer at minimum, possibly higher. Isabella pulled a blanket over him, then sat back against the shed wall, trembling with delayed shock. Thomas was dead. Her only brother, her best friend, the person who'd taught her to swim and sail and navigate by stars, drowned or shot or blown apart in that terrible battle. And she'd saved his killer instead. The thought made her stomach heat. She pressed her hand over her mouth, fighting nausea, fighting tears. Fighting the overwhelming urge to pick up father's gutting knife from the workbench and drive it through this stranger's heart. But her hands remained motionless. Because Thomas had chosen piracy, knowing its risks. Because this man might know what happened, might carry word of her brother's final moments. Because grief and revenge were different things, and she'd been raised to honor the difference. She must have dozed because when she opened her eyes again, the sun had shifted to late afternoon, and the pirate was awake, watching her with eyes the color of storm-dark seas. "You pulled me from the water." His voice carried the rough rasp of someone who'd swallowed too much seawater, accent suggesting English origins with Caribbean influence. Isabella nodded slowly, suddenly aware of how small the shed was, how close he lay, how very large he seemed, even prone and weaponless. Why? He pushed himself upright with visible effort, wincing as movement pulled at injuries. His gaze remained fixed on her face with unnerving intent. "I was looking for my brother." Her voice cracked on the final word. He was on one of those ships. Understanding flickered across his features. "The merchant vessel the Navy press-ganged last spring. We were freeing the crews when they attacked." He paused, studying her reaction. "Your brother fought bravely. I saw him take 2 Navy officers before the magazine exploded." The grief that had been hovering at bay crashed over her in devastating waves. Thomas was truly gone. Not captured, not impressed, dead, fighting for freedom he'd never taste again. "I'm sorry." The pirate's voice held unexpected gentleness. "Spoke of you often. Said his sister could outswim any man in Jamaica, that she feared nothing except letting her family starve." Isabella looked up sharply. "You knew him?" "He served on my ship for 3 months. Good sailor, better man." He shifted, reaching toward his belt before remembering his weapons were lost to the Caribbean depths. "I'm—" The shed door exploded inward. 200 men filled her father's property like a tide of violence and gunpowder. Armed pirates surrounded the cottage, their weapons glinting in late afternoon sun cutlasses, pistols, muskets, boarding axes. They moved with frightening efficiency, clearly experienced at exactly this kind of operation. A massive man with a scarred face and a bosun's whistle stepped through the shed doorway, his eyes widening at the sight within. "Captain Blackwood." "Thank God." The pirate Captain Blackwood rose to his feet with commanding presence that transformed him instantly from wounded castaway to absolute authority. "Stand down, Briggs. This woman saved my life. The Navy's hunting survivors, sir. We need to move." The bosun's gaze flickered to Isabella with open assessment. "What about her?" Captain Nathaniel Blackwood looked at Isabella for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind those storm-colored eyes. "She comes with us." Isabella's father returned at sunset to find his cottage surrounded by the most feared pirate crew in Caribbean waters. She watched from the shed doorway as he dropped his empty nets, face draining of color, hands rising slowly in universal gesture of surrender. "Father!" She pushed past 2 pirates guarding the entrance, running to him. "It's all right, they won't hurt you, Isabella." His weathered hands gripped her shoulders, searching her face for injuries. "What in God's name? I pulled their captain from the water this morning, after the battle." She couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't speak the words. "Thomas is dead." Not yet. Not when her voice would shatter like the ships on the rocks. Captain Blackwood emerged from the shed, moving with only slight stiffness despite his injuries. The setting sun caught the gold in his ears, the medallion at his throat, transforming him into something almost biblical and avenging angel wrapped in violence and sea spray. "Mr. Wade." His voice carried across the small property with natural command. "Your daughter saved my life at great personal risk. I am in her debt." Isabella's father stared at the pirate captain, decades of honest fishing life suddenly confronted with the brutal reality of Caribbean piracy. "Then take your men and go. Leave her be." "I wish I could." Blackwood's expression held genuine regret. "But the Royal Navy knows someone pulled me from the water. They're questioning every coastal family within 10 miles. When they find you, and they will, they'll consider you accomplices unless I provide an alternative explanation." "What alternative?" Isabella's voice was stronger than she felt. "You take me hostage? They think father helped you escape?" "Precisely." Blackwood's eyes never left hers. "The Navy believes dead men can't be hostages. They'll stop searching your family, mark me as lost at sea with my ship. And what happens to my daughter when you're finished using her as your excuse?" The question hung in cooling evening air. 200 pirates watched their captain with mix of curiosity and calculation. This was their territory: ruthless efficiency, strategic cruelty, doing whatever necessary to survive. Mercy was foreign territory. But Blackwood surprised them all. "She becomes crew, under my protection, with full share of prizes and voice in the ship's council." Murmurs rippled through the assembled pirates. Several exchanged meaningful glances. The bosun named Briggs cleared his throat. "Captain, the code states." "I know what the code states." Blackwood's tone could have cut glass. "I also know I'd be feeding sharks without her intervention. The crew will vote, as is their right. But I make my position clear. Isabella Wade has earned a place on the Serpent's blood." Isabella stared at him. "I'm not a pirate." "No." His eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity. "You're someone who swims into battles to save drowning men, who risks her life for strangers. Who possesses more courage than most men I've sailed with? He paused. You're also someone whose brother died serving on my ship, fighting for the freedom I promised him. The words hit like physical blows. Thomas. Her beautiful, reckless brother who'd wanted more than fishing nets and poverty, who'd sworn to return with treasure enough to save their family. I can't. She shook her head, tears burning behind her eyes. I can't leave father alone. Your father receives Thomas's full share from our last prize. Blackwood gestured to Briggs, who produced a leather pouch heavy with coin. 10 months of wages. Enough to hire crew, repair his boat, survive the next 5 years if he's careful. Her father took the pouch with trembling hands, weighing it, understanding the staggering amount of gold it contained. His eyes met hers across the evening shadows. Isabella, you don't have to, she does. Blackwood's voice softened slightly. The Navy will hunt her if she stays. They'll accuse her of aiding pirates, use her as leverage to find me. The only safety for either of you is if she's publicly taken as hostage, privately joining my crew. He looked at Isabella directly. I'm offering you a choice your brother never had. Willing service with fair compensation. Or I leave you to the Navy's mercy. Choose quickly. My men can't hold this position past dawn. The Caribbean wind whispered through palm trees, carrying the eternal smell of salt and freedom. Isabella thought of Thomas laughing as he taught her to swim, Thomas pointing out constellations and promising to navigate by them. Thomas hugging her goodbye and swearing he'd return wealthy enough to buy their freedom from endless poverty. Thomas, who'd died fighting for exactly what this dangerous captain now offered. She looked at her father's weathered face, seeing resignation and fear and reluctant pride warring in his expression. She looked at the 200 armed pirates surrounding her simple life. She looked at Captain Nathaniel Blackwood, who watched her with eyes that held storms and secrets and something that might have been respect. I'll go. The words emerged steady despite her shaking hands. But I want your word, your oath on the pirate code that father remains untouched, that the Navy never learns the truth. Blackwood's scarred hand extended toward her, palm up, waiting. On my honor as captain and the code that governs us, I swear it. Isabella placed her hand in his, feeling calluses and strength and the electric shock of contact that would change everything. Behind them, the crew began to cheer. The Serpent's blood rose from the horizon like a nightmare made manifest 3 masts of blackened wood. Hull painted deep crimson that looked like dried blood in morning light, sails the color of storm clouds. Isabella stood on the longboat's bow as 20 pirates rowed toward the legendary ship, her heart hammering against her ribs with every stroke that brought her closer to a world she'd only heard whispered about in port taverns. Captain Blackwood sat across from her, his presence filling the small craft despite sitting in silence. He'd changed into fresh clothing from supplies his men brought, brat black breeches tucked into salt-stained boots, white shirt open at the throat revealing tattoos that spread across his chest, leather vest adorned with silver buckles that caught the morning sun. His long, dark hair was tied back with a red cord, revealing the full extent of scars mapping his face and neck. 3 pistols hung from his belt alongside a cutlass that looked like it had tasted considerable blood over many years. You're afraid. His voice was pitched low enough that only she could hear over the rhythmic splash of oars and the creaking of wood against water. I'd be stupid not to be. Isabella kept her chin high, despite trembling hands hidden in her waterlogged skirts. I'm boarding a pirate ship with 200 men who've killed for less than the clothes on my back. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, transforming his face briefly into something less predatory. True enough. But you're under my protection, and I don't make promises I can't keep. He leaned forward slightly, storm-colored eyes holding hers with uncomfortable intensity. You saved my life, Isabella Wade. In my world, that debt is sacred, written in blood and honored above all else. Any man who touches you answers to me, and I haven't lost a challenge in 15 years at sea. The longboat bumped against the ship's massive hull with a hollow thud. Rope ladders unfurled down the crimson sides like serpents descending. Isabella stared up at the towering vessel, suddenly understanding with visceral clarity why merchant ships surrendered at the mere sight of Blackwood's flag on the horizon. The serpent's blood didn't just look dangerous. It radiated barely controlled violence, every line of her design speaking of speed and power, a weapon crafted for one purpose, taking what it wanted from anyone foolish enough to resist. Ladies first. Blackwood gestured to the latter with marked courtesy that might have been insulting if his eyes hadn't held genuine encouragement beneath the dangerous glint. Isabella grabbed the rough hemp rope, refusing to show the weakness trembling through her exhausted muscles. She'd climbed rigging on her father's fishing boat since childhood, small hands learning to grip and balance before she could write her own name, but this was different sear for hemp that scraped her palms raw. Longer distance that made her arms burn, and 200 pirates watching her every move from above with predatory assessment. Her muscles screamed protest by the time she reached the rail, but she hauled herself over with determination born of pure stubbornness and the memory of Thomas climbing this same ladder months ago. The crew assembled in traditional formation, officers in their worn coats, near the quarterdeck where the ship's wheels stood like a throne. Common sailors filling the main deck, everyone armed and watchful. They were a diverse collection that spoke to the democratic brutality of pirate life, English and Spanish, African and Caribbean. Some barely older than Isabella with smooth faces and nervous energy, others weathered by decades at sea until their skin resembled old leather and their eyes held the flat stare of men who'd seen too much death. But they all shared the same predatory awareness, the same casual relationship with violence that made her skin prickle with instinctive alarm even as she forced herself to meet their collective gaze. Blackwood climbed aboard with fluid grace despite his injuries, his boots hitting the deck with authority that immediately transformed him from dangerous stranger to absolute commander. The crew straightened unconsciously, hands moving away from weapons, attention focusing with almost military precision on their captain's battered but unbowed form. "Gentlemen!" His voice carried across the deck without shouting, projecting natural command that came from years of being obeyed without question. "As you know, we lost the Crimson Dawn and 37 good men yesterday to Navy treachery. Among the fallen was Thomas Waida, sailor who proved his worth in every engagement, who died fighting for the freedom we all cherish more than gold or safety." Solemn murmurs rippled through the assembled pirates. Several removed their tricorn hats in respect, weathered hands holding them over hearts that understood loss as their constant. "This is his sister, Isabella Wade, who pulled me from the sea at great personal risk when she could have let me drown." Blackwood's scarred hand settled on her shoulder, possessive but not threatening, claiming and protecting simultaneously in a gesture the crew would understand completely. "She's earned a place on this ship. The vote as the code demands and as we've always honored." The quartermaster stepped forward, a lean man with graying beard braided with colored beads, calculating eyes that had assessed countless situations and made the hard decisions required for survival. Captains made his position clear as Caribbean waters. "All in favor of accepting Miss Wade as crew with full privileges, under the code that governs us all?" Hands rose across the deck like a forest of agreement. Not all, perhaps 30 men kept their arms down, faces skeptical or openly hostile, eyes promising future challenges to this unprecedented situation. But the majority voted in her favor with enthusiasm that suggested Thomas had been well liked, and in pirate democracy, majority ruled with absolute finality. Motion carries by clear vote. The quartermaster nodded to Isabella with something approaching respect tinging his assessment. "Welcome to the Serpent's Blood, Miss Wade. You'll answer to Boatswain Briggs for duties and training, receive equal share of all prizes we take, and maintain voting rights in all ship matters as befits a member of this brotherhood." He paused meaningfully, making sure she understood the full weight of what came next. You'll also be held to the same code as every man aboard. Disobey orders in battle, steal from your brothers, or betray this crew's trust, and you'll answer to the same justice we all face, without exception or mercy. Isabella understood perfectly, reading the unspoken threat beneath the formal welcome. The code that protected her also enslaved her to its brutal logic. One wrong move, one perceived betrayal. And these men would show her exactly how pirates handled traitors, and the Caribbean depths kept those secrets forever. I understand completely. Her voice remained steady, despite the weight of 200 predatory gazes, measuring her worth and finding it uncertain. I'll honor the code as my brother did, with my life if necessary. Blackwood's hand squeezed her shoulder once before releasing, a brief gesture of approval before he returned to his role as captain. Briggs will show you to quarters. We sail with the evening tide, the Navy's still hunting survivors along the coast, and I'd rather not give them another chance at my ship or my crew. As the assembled pirates dispersed to their duties with practiced efficiency, Isabella followed the scarred bosun below deck, her boots loud on wooden stairs that descended into the ship's belly. She tried not to think about how completely her life had changed in one blood-soaked morning, tried not to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake accepting the captain's protection in this dangerous new world. But she couldn't ignore the small, reckless part of her that felt more alive on this ship of violence and freedom than she'd ever felt standing safely on shore, watching the horizon and dreaming of everything beyond her small existence. Isabella's quarters were nothing like she'd imagined during sleepless nights listening to Thomas's stories. Instead of a dank cell or hammock strung among common sailors in the crew's quarters, Briggs led her to a small cabin on the officer's deck, modest but private, with an actual bunk built into the wall, a sea chest for personal belongings, and a porthole overlooking endless Caribbean blue that shifted between turquoise and deep navy depending on the sun's angle. The cabin had belonged to the first mate lost in yesterday's battle, though Briggs didn't mention this detail with words. Isabella saw it in the personal effects still scattered about: a carved wooden comb, a diary written in flowing Spanish script, a miniature portrait of a dark-haired woman with sad eyes and a gentle smile. You'll want to secure that portrait and anything else loose. Briggs gestured around the small space with his scarred hand. Storm's coming tonight. I can feel it in my bones, and my bones are never wrong about weather. Everything not tied down ends up on the floor when the ship pitches hard, and Caribbean storms pitch us like a child's toy. Isabella picked up the small painting carefully, studying the woman's face and wondering what story connected her to the dead first mate. What happened to her? Dead 3 years now. Yellow fever swept through Port Royal. The bosun's scarred face softened briefly with memory and loss. Martinez kept her picture close even after she was gone, said she was waiting for him in whatever came after this life of blood, and he spoke to it sometimes, late at night when he thought no one could hear. Briggs cleared his throat, embarrassed by the sentiment in this world that rewarded hardness. Captain says you're to have fresh clothing and weapons training starting tomorrow morning. Can't have crew that can't defend the ship when Navy or rival captains come calling with cannons and boarding parties. The casual mention of combat made her stomach twist with anxiety she tried to hide. I've never held a weapon beyond my father's fishing knife. You will soon enough. Briggs's smile held no humor, just grim acknowledgement of necessity. This life doesn't allow passengers, girl. Everyone fights when it matters, everyone pulls their weight, or everyone dies together when ships go down or enemies board us. That's not cruelty, that's survival. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame, his expression serious. Fair warning, some of the crew aren't happy about a woman aboard. Old superstitions die hard at sea, and some men believe females bring bad luck to ships. They'll test you, push boundaries, see if the captain's protection holds when he's not watching your back. Show weakness, and they'll make your life miserable in 100 small ways. Show strength, and eventually, they'll respect you. That's how it works in this brotherhood. After he left, Isabella sat on the narrow bunk, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of her decision and the impossibility of reversing it. Through the salt-stained porthole, she could see her father's coastline growing smaller as the serpent's blood caught wind in her massive sails and surged toward open water with the power of barely controlled violence. Everything familiar, everything safe, disappearing behind them like morning mist burned away by merciless Caribbean sun. Her father stood alone now in that cottage, counting gold that couldn't replace his children, watching the horizon for a daughter who would never return. A hesitant knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. She opened the door to find a young pirate barely 20 years old, with sun-bleached hair pulled back in a leather thong and nervous energy radiating from his lean frame, holding a bundle of clothing wrapped in oilcloth. "Captain's orders, miss." He thrust the bundle at her awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation of addressing a woman on a pirate ship. "Can't have you working deck in those wet skirts. They'll tangle in rigging and get you killed first storm. Captain says to tell you dinner's at sunset in his cabin. Officers eat together on the serpent's blood, talk strategy, and share the good rum." The clothes proved practical when she unwrapped them. 3 loose cotton shirts that would breathe in Caribbean heat. 2 pairs of leather breeches that would actually fit once she rolled the legs and cinched the waist with the provided belt. A vest with multiple pockets for tools and personal items. And sturdy boots only slightly too large that she could stuff with cloth. No dresses, no skirts, nothing that would tangle in rigging or slow her down during the violence this life promised with absolute certainty. Isabella changed quickly, studying her reflection in the small mirror mounted above the wash basin. She looked like a boy playing pirate, like someone completely unrecognizable from the girl who'd gathered clams on the beach just yesterday morning with empty stomach and simple dreams. Her sun-bleached hair hung in a practical braid down her back. Her face already showed signs of windburn from hours exposed on the longboat. Her eyes looked different somehow, harder, more aware of darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the world. Thomas would have laughed himself sick seeing her dressed like this, would have made jokes about her looking like a cabin boy until she punched his arm. The thought brought fresh grief crashing through her careful composure like waves through a broken hull. Her brother had sailed these very waters, eaten meals on this deck, probably stood in this exact cabin plotting courses to freedom and counting prize shares, and had died fighting for the liberty she now inherited through his sacrifice and her impulsive decision to save a drowning pirate captain. The weight of that inheritance settled heavy on her shoulders as sunset painted the Caribbean in shades of gold and crimson. She stood outside the captain's cabin as the sun touched the horizon, heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Before her knuckles touched the weathered wood, the door swung open. Blackwood's cabin was larger than she'd expected, a proper stateroom that spoke of years of successful piracy. Maps covered every available wall space, some torn and salt-stained, others new and detailed. A massive desk sat buried under charts and navigation instruments that gleamed in lamplight. A dining table dominated the center, where 5 officers already sat drinking rum from pewter cups, their conversation pausing as she entered. They looked up with expressions ranging from open curiosity to outright hostility that promised future challenges. "Gentlemen, you know Miss Wade." Blackwood rose from his seat at the table's head with natural authority, gesturing to an empty chair positioned at his right hand. "She's dining with officers from this point forward, as befits her status as crew." The quartermaster Cornelius Sharp raised his cup in a sardonic salute, his calculating eyes never leaving her face. "To the newest member of our brotherhood. May she prove as capable as her brother Thomas, and considerably more fortunate in battle." Isabella took the offered seat, intensely aware of Blackwood's proximity mere inches away, of the way every man at this table could kill her without breaking stride or losing sleep. But Thomas had earned their respect through courage and competence, and she'd be damned to hell itself if she showed less bravery than her younger brother. The meal proved surprisingly civilized: roasted fish seasoned with stolen spices, fresh bread that must have come from their last port stop, tropical fruit likely taken from some merchant's cargo hold. The officers discussed navigation routes and supply needs with the casual efficiency of men who'd worked together for years through storms and battles. They included her peripherally in the conversation, explaining nautical terms when she looked confused, acknowledging her presence without quite accepting it as permanent reality. Halfway through dinner, the ship lurched violently without warning. Thunder boomed overhead as the promised storm arrived with the sudden fury that characterized Caribbean weather. Rain hammered the deck above them like musket fire, and wind howled through the rigging with banshee intensity that penetrated even the captain's thick-walled cabin. "All hands to deck," Briggs's voice roared through the sudden chaos. "Secure the mainsail before she tears the whole mast down." The officers abandoned their meal instantly, racing topside with the practiced urgency of men who understood that hesitation in storms meant death for everyone aboard. Isabella followed automatically, driven by instinct rather than thought, emerging onto a deck transformed into absolute nightmare. Massive waves crashed over the rails with enough force to sweep men overboard. Wind strong enough to knock a person from their feet howled across the deck. Darkness was broken only by lightning that revealed crew members scrambling through rigging like spiders on a web, fighting desperately to save their ship from the storm's fury. "Get below deck now!" Blackwood grabbed her arm roughly, shouting to be heard over the storm's roar. "You're not trained for this kind of weather." Neither was Thomas's first storm. She pulled free with strength born of desperation and stubbornness, stumbling toward where sailors fought to secure a massive sail threatening to tear the mainmast down completely. "I can help, I know rope work." Before he could physically stop her, Isabella grabbed the loose line whipping in the wind and pulled with every ounce of strength her fishing life had built into her arms and back. The rough hemp immediately burned her palms bloody, but she held on with grim determination, adding her weight to the desperate struggle against wind, trying to shred their ship apart, plank by plank. And somewhere in that howling darkness, fighting alongside men who'd been complete strangers just hours ago, Isabella Wade stopped being a simple fisherman's daughter and became something else entirely, something harder, braver, and infinitely more dangerous than the girl who'd gathered clams and dreamed of distant horizons. The storm raged for 3 endless days and nights. 3 days of waves like moving mountains that threatened to capsize them with every swell, wind like sharpened knives that cut through clothing and found skin beneath, and exhaustion so complete and overwhelming that Isabella fell asleep standing upright during the brief moments when her rope-burned hands were desperately needed to keep the ship from breaking apart. She learned more about true sailing in those 72 brutal hours than a lifetime watching her father's small fishing boat navigate calm coastal waters, learned that ships were living things requiring constant attention and care, that the sea killed without malice or mercy or any consideration for human wants. That survival meant trusting people you barely knew with your life and theirs with you in return. When dawn finally broke calm and golden on the 4th morning, the Serpent's blood looked like she'd fought and barely survived a war. Torn sails hung in tatters from damaged rigging. Broken spars littered the deck among scattered debris. The entire ship had been scoured clean by waves that had nearly capsized them at least twice during the worst hours. But they'd survived through skill and determination and the kind of teamwork that only emerged when death was the alternative. And the exhausted crew looked at Isabella differently now, with respect earned rather than grudgingly given. She'd proven herself when it truly mattered, had held rope alongside seasoned sailors, and refused to quit even when her hands bled freely and her body screamed for rest that wouldn't come. Captain Blackwood found her during the morning watch, slumped against the mainmast's solid bulk with her damaged hands wrapped in makeshift cloth bandages stained rust-brown with dried blood. He'd ditched his captain's coat during the storm's height, working the deck like any common sailor without regard for rank or privilege, and now stood before her in just his torn shirt and salt-stained breeches, his long dark hair loose and wild around his scarred face, looking more like some ancient sea god than a mortal man. "You should be resting in your cabin," He crouched beside her with fluid grace, taking one of her bandaged hands in his own scarred fingers with surprising gentleness that contradicted his fearsome reputation. Briggs reported you worked through the entire night without break. That's foolish, even for someone trying to prove themselves. So did everyone else aboard this ship. Isabella was too exhausted for the fear or formality that had characterized their earlier interactions. That's what the code means, isn't it? Everyone gives everything they have, or the ship sinks, and everyone drowns together without exception. No passengers, no weakness, just survival through collective effort. Something flickered in his storm-colored eyes that might have been approval, or perhaps recognition of a kindred spirit. Your brother Thomas said almost exactly the same words, his first storm, aboard my ship. Told me afterward he'd rather die trying to save the crew than live knowing he'd been a coward when it mattered. He paused, thumb brushing carefully over her bandaged palm where blood had soaked through. You're more like him than I expected when I first saw you on that beach. Same courage, same stubborn refusal to quit. The casual touch sent unexpected electricity racing up her arm and through her chest. Isabella pulled her hand back quickly, suddenly intensely aware they were essentially alone on this section of deck, that the sun was rising behind him in spectacular glory, turning his wild hair to dark flame shot through with copper highlights. That beneath the pirate captain's terrifying reputation lived someone who'd worked the storm alongside his crew without demanding special treatment, and now showed genuine concern for her injuries, rather than just viewing her as a useful tool. I don't know what I am anymore. The exhausted confession escaped before she could stop it. Her usual careful guard lowered by days without sleep. 4 days ago, I was a fisherman's daughter, gathering clams to keep from starving. Today, I'm a pirate who can't ever go home without being hanged as a traitor to the crown. Everything I knew is gone. Today, you're someone who saved lives during a storm that would have killed lesser sailors. Someone who earned the crew's respect through actions rather than words. Blackwood rose smoothly, offering his hand to help her up with steady strength. Come to my cabin. I have proper salve for those rope burns, and you need real rest before the next crisis arrives, because there's always another crisis waiting on the horizon in this life. Isabella let him pull her to her feet, stumbling slightly as exhaustion made her legs unsteady. His arm caught her waist instinctively, steadying her against the ship's gentle roll in the calmer morning waters. For a long moment they stood too close, his chest solid and warm against her shoulder, his breath stirring the loose hair at her temple. The scent of him overwhelmed her dulled senses, salt and sweat and leather and something fundamentally masculine that made her heart race with more than simple fear. Captain, her weak protest died as his expression shifted subtly, stormed arc eyes dropping to her mouth with unmistakable hunger that sent heat flooding through her exhausted body. Nathaniel. His voice emerged as rough velvet that made something deep inside her respond. When we're alone like this, call me Nathaniel. I'm tired of being just the fearsome Captain Blackwood. The intimacy of his given name felt dangerous, like deliberately stepping off the edge of her father's boat into water too deep to measure or escape. But Isabella was already drowning in ways that had nothing to do with the Caribbean, had been drowning since the desperate moment she'd pulled him from those cold waters, and felt his heart beating strong and steady against her exhausted arms. Nathaniel. The name tasted like freedom and forbidden fruit on her tongue. He led her through the ship to his private cabin, sat her carefully in his own chair before the desk cluttered with charts, and tended her rope-burned hands with a gentleness that completely contradicted everything his brutal reputation promised to enemies. The salve he applied from a small ceramic jar smelled pleasantly of herbs and his touch remained careful and controlled despite the obvious calluses marking his dangerous hands from years of rope and sword work. Why are you really helping me like this? Isabella watched his bent head as he worked with focused attention, studying the multiple scars visible along his neck where long hair had fallen aside. You could have left me safely on shore with my father, paid Thomas's share as promised, and forgotten about both of us completely. Why bring me into this dangerous world? Nathaniel's skilled hands stilled their ministrations. When he looked up, his expression held something raw and unguarded that she'd never seen before. Because you dove into a deadly battle without hesitation, trying to save your brother, showing more courage than most men I've sailed with. Because you worked the storm until your hands bled freely and refused to quit when anyone else would have collapsed. Because you're the first person in 15 long years who looked at me and saw a man worth saving instead of a monster worth fearing or using. His thumb traced the edge of her bandage with devastating tenderness. And because when I'm near you, I remember what it felt like to want something other than revenge and gold, to want something good and real. The raw confession hung between them like lightning-charged air before a storm breaks. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as his hand rose slowly to cup her jaw, thumb brushing across her lower lip with clear question and unspoken promise that made her pulse race. This is dangerous. She barely recognized her own breathless voice. You're my captain. The code has rules about relationships that could compromise. The code forbids forcing any crew member into anything unwanted. His eyes searched hers with fierce intensity that saw too much. But it doesn't forbid this between us. Not if you choose it freely with full understanding of what you're accepting. Isabella should have pulled away to safety, should have remembered she'd known this dangerous man for only 4 days, that he was a pirate captain with blood on his hands and violence in his long history, should have protected herself from the inevitable heartbreak of wanting someone whose entire world existed outside all civilized laws in any concept of safety. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him. Nathaniel responded instantly with barely restrained hunger, his other hand sliding into her hair to cradle her head, deepening the kiss with passion that spoke of years of loneliness and careful isolation. He tasted like the storm and rum and dangerous promises, kissed her like she was treasure worth more than all the gold in Caribbean waters or all the ships he'd taken. Isabella melted against his solid warmth, her exhausted body suddenly electric with sensation, her damaged hands fisting desperately in his shirt as years of careful safety and prescribed behavior shattered, completely against this single moment of reckless want. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard and unsteady, reality crashed back over them with uncomfortable weight. The crew, Isabella started, but couldn't finish the thought. We'll follow the code completely. Nathaniel's voice was granite certainty. Any man who challenges what's mine answers directly to me, and I have never lost a challenge. Not once. His hand remained gentle in her hair, despite the violence in his words. Contradiction of brutality and tenderness that somehow defined him entirely. But you need to understand completely what you're choosing by being here. This life, this ship, there's no going back to safety ever again. The Navy wants us dead or dancing from nooses. Rival captains want my territory and my ship. Every single day risks your life in ways your quiet fishing village never imagined possible. I know the risks. Isabella met his fierce gaze without flinching away from the truth. Thomas knew them too, and he chose freedom anyway despite the danger. Maybe I'm finally brave enough to make the same choice he did, to live free rather than die slowly. And Nathaniel's smile transformed his scarred face into something almost beautiful that took her breath away. Then welcome to the serpent's blood, Isabella Wade. Welcome to freedom and danger and whatever storms come next for us. Through the salt-stained porthole, the Caribbean stretched endless and impossibly blue, calling them toward distant horizons where anything was possible and nothing was certain except the solid ship beneath them, the code that bound them together, and the impossible connection forged between a pirate captain and the brave girl who'd saved his life and lost her heart in the process.